one death changed the language of an entire country for centuries. In January of 1066, childless English King Edward the Confessor died. He left no direct heir. The throne stood empty. Almost immediately, several contenders claimed their right to that vacant throne, from the local Earl Harold to a duke across the channel named William. Their clash reshaped not only the political map of the island, but also the English language itself, which absorbed thousands of French words that we still hear today. How did the struggle between the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans for control of England unfold? But before we dive into the events of 1066, we need to rewind time, far back, because this island in the North Sea had long acted like a magnet for conquerors. To understand why, we have to start at the very beginning. Britain was originally home to Celtic tribes. Then the Romans arrived and stayed for 400 years. 4 centuries wasn't just a raid. They built roads, fortresses, cities. Latin filled official documents. Hot baths warmed stone villas. Britain became a full province of the Roman Empire. But in the year 407, the legions withdrew. Rome was falling apart. Soldiers were needed on the continent. The island was left without an army, without governance, without protection. It was like a phone suddenly cut off from internet, signal, and GPS. Hardware intact, but nothing to work with. And someone immediately seized that vacuum. From the area we now call Denmark, Germanic tribes, the Angles and Saxons, flooded onto the island. Around the year 450, they founded the first kingdom, Kent, and began systematically pushing the Celtic peoples westward into the mountains of Wales and Cornwall. Over time, these newcomers spread across the entire island, establishing several kingdoms that often clashed with each other. They gave the land a new name, England, literally, Land of the Angles. It seemed the island finally had its rulers, but soon enough, those rulers would find themselves victims. In the 9th century, a new wave surged out of Scandinavia, the Vikings. Their longships, slim war vessels with shallow drafts, could navigate any river. Crews of 40 to 60 warriors would raid a coastal monastery, plunder it within an hour, and be gone before the local militia could even muster. But the Vikings didn't stop at raiding. They carved out an entire region in northern England called the Danelaw, the land ruled by Danish law. There, Scandinavian customs thrived, Scandinavian law prevailed, and the Scandinavian tongue was spoken. Half of England had effectively become part of the northern world. The only one who stood firm against this threat was Alfred, King of Wessex. Later, he would be called Alfred the Great, the only English monarch to ever earn that title. Alfred struck a truce with the Vikings, drawing clear lines. The southwest belonged to the Anglo-Saxons, the northeast to the Danes, and he was the first to call himself King of England. Not just Wessex, not just Mercia, but all of England. In other words, he planted the very idea of a united kingdom on this island. His son took it further, conquering the Danelaw and uniting England under one crown for the first time. But that fragile stability wouldn't last long. In the year 1016, King Canute the Great of Denmark, who already ruled Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, conquered England and made London the capital of his North Sea Empire. Remember this moment, the Empire of Canute. It would play its part in history. For 19 years, London stood at the heart of a Scandinavian superpower stretching from Norway to England. But after Canute's death, the empire crumbled, just like all empires built around a single ruler. The Anglo-Saxons drove out the Scandinavians and restored their own dynasty to the throne, Edward the Confessor. This devout king would die in 1066 without an heir, setting off a chain of events that would change everything. Now, let's turn our attention to what was happening across the English Channel during that time. About 100 years before these events, uninvited guests arrived in northern France. The Normans, descendants of the very Vikings who ravaged England, made their mark. Their leader was named Rollo the Walker. Legend says he earned that nickname because no horse could carry his weight, so this towering Scandinavian simply walked everywhere. Rollo and his men sailed up the Seine on their longships, pillaging everything within reach. The French king found a clever solution. Instead of fighting one group of Vikings, he hired another. He granted Rollo the city of Rouen and the surrounding lands, in exchange for protecting the Seine from raids by his own people. The territory settled by these northerners took on a fitting name, Normandy, literally, the land of the Northmen, and its rulers became dukes. Here's the fascinating part. On both sides of the channel, you find descendants of the same Scandinavian seafarers. England, steeped in Danish influence from the lands of Danelaw to the Empire of Canute. Normandy, born from a Viking camp along the banks of the Seine. Two worlds sharing northern roots, destined to collide in one of history's most famous battles just a few generations later. But to understand why the Normans became such a dire threat to the island, we first need to explore the conditions that shaped their leader, the man who was branded a bastard at birth. Rouen, the early 11th century. A stone cathedral, a Latin mass, a duke in the saddle, chainmail, spurs, a banner emblazoned with leopards. If one of Rollo the Walker's companions had seen this scene, they wouldn't recognize their descendants. In just over 100 years, the Normans covered ground that took other peoples centuries to traverse. They no longer spoke Old Norse. In the halls of their castles, the Norman dialect of French echoed instead. They no longer prayed to Odin. Their dukes donated lands to monasteries and built abbeys. They no longer lived in longhouses. They raised stone keeps and surrounded them with moats. By the 11th century, this was no longer a Viking war band on dragon ships. It was a full-fledged feudal state, complete with knights, vassals, bishops, and a strict hierarchy of power. This was the machine that a 7-year-old boy would inherit. But before he could inherit it, he had to be born. And that's where the story truly begins. His father's name was Robert. Later, chroniclers would nickname him the Devil, either for his fierce temper or for settling family disputes with poison. His mother was named Herleva. She was the daughter of a tanner, or perhaps a gravedigger. Sources disagree. Either way, she was a commoner. Not a duchess, not a countess, not even a minor noblewoman, just a craftswoman from the town of Falaise. Robert of Harleve never married. To understand why this wasn't unusual, we need to take a step back. Despite their outward Catholic devotion, the Norman dukes held on to old Viking customs in their personal lives. Mistresses, second wives, children from different women, these were the norms for Scandinavian leaders. The church gritted its teeth but tolerated it. The problem was that church law and feudal inheritance followed different rules. A child born outside a sanctioned marriage carried a mark, a bastard, illegitimate. It's like being named CEO of a major company, but everyone knows your degree is fake. On paper, you hold the position. In reality, half the people think they have a better claim to your seat. William was born around the year 1027 or 28. No one knows the exact date. Robert acknowledged him. More than that, he declared William his sole heir. That was unusual, but Robert didn't care about being typical. In 1034, the Duke set out on a pilgrimage. Not for hunting, not for war. He was heading to Jerusalem. Across Europe, over the Mediterranean Sea, to the Holy Land. A journey few returned from in those days. Before leaving, he forced the Norman barons to swear allegiance to young William. The barons swore their oaths. Robert left, and he never came back. He died on the way home, in the city of Nicaea, in what is now Turkey. Illness, poisoning, exhaustion, we don't know. But one thing is clear, Normandy was left with a 7-year-old duke, the son of a tanner and a corpse. The barons' promises held about as well as wet paper. In other words, not at all. The duchy collapsed into chaos. Any baron with enough men and ambition decided he was better suited to rule than the boy bastard. Bloodshed erupted. They appointed a guardian for William and killed him. A second guardian, also killed. A third, the same fate. 3 regents in 5 years, all dead. According to the chronicles, one was stabbed right in the room where the young duke slept. The boy lay in the dark, hearing someone being cut down just beyond the wall. He was around 10 years old, maybe 11. There were attempts on William himself. Peasants hid him in houses, in barns, among livestock. The future conqueror of England spent nights on hay because if he stayed in his own castle, they would have killed him before dawn. This is the moment to pause. It's easy to look back from the 21st century and think, what a wild time, what fierce people. But imagine yourself as a Norman baron in the year 1035. There's no central authority. Law belongs to whoever wields the most swords. And on the throne sits a child, born to a commoner whom half the nobility refuses to recognize as legitimate. In this world, conspiracy isn't betrayal, it's a calculated choice. The only language everyone understood was power. The boy learned this lesson, not from books, not from mentors, they were all killed. He learned it from the scent of blood on cold stone floors, from desperate escapes in the dead of night, from faces of men who swore to protect him by day and sharpened knives by night. By the time William stopped being a child, trust had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Surviving this slaughterhouse was already a feat, but survival bought him only one thing: another day. To hold on to the duchy, he needed something more. He had to make all those barons, with their own retinues and ambitions, accept the authority of a man they'd known since childhood as the bastard. And for that, there was only one tool: the very language he had learned in the shadows of Norman castles. He first needed this weapon when he was just 19. Not on a hunt, not in a tournament, but in a real war where the loser doesn't get back up. His cousin, Guy de Brieuze, sparked a rebellion. And this wasn't some small, disgruntled faction. Nearly half of the Norman nobility joined him. Half. Every other baron, every second castle, every other troop of mounted knights in the duchy. These were people who had sworn loyalty, yet they turned their spears against the very man they pledged to serve. The official excuse could be anything: a land dispute, an insult, a question of inheritance. But the real reason was clear. A bastard sat on the throne, and it was time to fix that. William was just 19 years old. He had no experience leading major campaigns. No seasoned generals stood behind him to guide his hand. They had been killed when he was still a child. On the surface, the outcome seemed inevitable. A boy facing a coalition of battle-hardened warriors, each with their own castles and loyal troops. Yet this boy turned rebellion into his very first test of what it meant to be a duke. The civil war in Normandy didn't last months. It stretched on for years. Castle after castle fell, siege after siege wore down defenders, and skirmish after skirmish erupted. The damp Norman fields soaked through to the bone, villages smoldered in smoke, and mud piled knee-high against fortress walls. William crushed the uprising with relentless determination, like a man who had nowhere left to fall back to. Because, in truth, he really had nowhere to turn. Losing didn't mean exile or negotiation, it meant death. Bastards aren't granted mercy. And he won. He quelled the revolt, reclaimed control, and forced the surviving rebels to bow their heads, all before he turned 20. But the problems didn't end there. In fact, they were just getting started. Normandy was officially a vassal of the French crown. In simple terms, the Duke of Normandy was supposed to answer to the King of France, yet in reality, he acted like an independent ruler. Enter King Henry I of France. He saw the young duke, who was growing stronger by the day, as a threat, so Henry raised an army and marched on Normandy. The French army outnumbered the Normans. The king's resources ran deeper. By every rule of medieval logic, William was supposed to lose. But here's where we need to pause and dive into what happened near the town of Mortimer, because this wasn't just a battle. It was a defining moment that reveals the character of the commander. William refused to line up his troops for a straightforward head-on clash. Instead, he did something unexpected. When the French vanguard reached the town of Mortimer, William didn't defend it. He simply retreated. The French knights took the town, settled into the houses, and found their way to the local wine and ale supplies. Evening came, roofs overhead, the warmth of the hearth, and cups brimming. After days marching along the rugged Norman roads, it felt like a well-earned rest. By nightfall, the vanguard was drunk. And then William set the town on fire. Flames erupted from multiple directions at once. Wooden houses caught fire instantly, crackling, heat, smoke that stung the eyes and choked the throat. French soldiers stumbled out of the burning buildings, half-dressed, unarmed, blinded by the blaze. Outside, Normandy's cavalry waited. This wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The vanguard ceased to exist. When news of Mortimer reached the main French forces, King Henry I turned his army around and retreated. No grand pitched battle, no hours-long clash with an uncertain outcome. William won the war with a single fire and one night of patience. Anyone else in his shoes would have charged at the first chance, eager to prove bravery, to show valor. William chose to wait. He let the enemy offer their own necks, and that says more about him than winning 10 tournaments ever could. Here's the interesting part. After Mortimer, after crushing the rebellion, after all of Normandy learned it was better not to cross this man, William didn't stop. He kept fighting. Campaign after campaign. Tournaments where he took the field himself, lance in hand. Hunts, back then not a pastime, but a form of training. Riding full speed, throwing javelins, chasing prey through dense forests. Why? He already had his duchy. The rebels lay defeated. The French king had pulled back. He could have settled into his castle, collected taxes, and grown old in peace. But he didn't. And the reason lies in one word, that same word that haunted him from birth. Bastard. Illegitimate. The son of a tanner's daughter. In a world where the right to rule was decided by blood, his blood was half wrong. Any Norman baron with a flawless pedigree could look at him and wonder, why him and not me? The only thing keeping that thought locked inside the baron's head, rather than on the tip of his sword, was fear. Fear of the man who destroyed the French vanguard in a burning city. Fear of the 19-year-old who crushed a coalition of his own relatives. But fear is a fragile currency. The moment you stop winning, the barons start to forget. They begin whispering. They start counting swords. For William, the world was more dangerous than war. Every month without victory edged him closer to the next conspiracy. Here's a strange paradox. The man who craved stability could only achieve it through instability. The one who hungered for recognition could claim it only by force. The machine he built, the most disciplined, most efficient army in all of France, couldn't afford to stay still. It had to move. The only question was where. The answer came from across the channel. In England, a king was dying without an heir, and that king's mother was Norman. Emma of Normandy. That name turned a family connection into a reason for invasion. Edward the Confessor's mother was related to William, not closely, not directly, but in the 11th century, that was enough. Edward spent nearly 30 years in exile in Normandy. He grew up among Norman barons. He spoke French better than English. When he finally returned to England and took the throne, the Norman court saw it as a small victory. After all, one of their own occupied the English crown. Then this one of their own died without an heir. For William, that meant only one thing. The crown belonged to him. The logic was simple. He raised the king, fed him, protected him. Now the kingdom was his inheritance. The problem was, this logic existed only in William's mind. But the Duke held one more ace up his sleeve. William claimed that Edward had personally promised him the English crown during his lifetime. Verbally, without any witnesses. Or rather, witnesses did appear, but conveniently, they were all Normans. There isn't a single English document or Anglo-Saxon chronicle to back up this promise. The only source comes from Norman chronicles written after the conquest. That means after William's victory, when he could essentially tell historians what to write. But wait, if this promise was so airtight, why did Edward, on his deathbed, name someone else entirely as his heir? To understand what happened next, we need to step back and unpack how power actually transferred in Anglo-Saxon England. Because it didn't work like it did on the continent, not even close. In England, they had the Witan Council, a gathering of the wisest. This assembly included the most powerful lords, bishops, and earls, and it formally chose the king. It didn't just confirm an heir, it actually selected the ruler. Usually, power stayed within one family, a clan that, by tradition, traced its roots back to the god Wotan, known to us as Odin. But passing the crown from father to son wasn't automatic. The council could pick a brother, an uncle, a nephew, anyone they deemed worthy. Imagine a company's board of directors, after the founder's death, choosing a new CEO not from the family, but simply the best candidate. This system, this uniquely Anglo-Saxon approach, flipped everything upside down. Because a formal heir did exist, Edgar Atheling, the great-nephew of Edward, a direct descendant of the ancient royal bloodline. His bloodline was flawless, his genealogy perfect. But there was one problem. He was just 14 years old, a boy, a teenager with no army, no allies, and no battle experience. In peaceful times, he might have been crowned under the guardianship of a regent, but January of 1666 was far from peaceful. Across the English Channel, a hungry Norman duke watched closely. From the north came the Norwegian king. England didn't need a teenager with the right bloodline, it needed a warrior with a sword in his hand. And such a warrior appeared instantly. Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, the most powerful man in England after the king. Right after Edward's death, literally within a day, Harold summoned the Witenagemot in London. The council's makeup was no accident. Most of those present were his allies, southern lords tied to the Godwinson family. The northern nobles hadn't even made it in time. The council voted, and Harold was crowned at Westminster Abbey, the very cathedral where Edward had been buried just days before. The stones still held the chill of funeral candles, and already the wax from the coronation was dripping down them. Speed shaped the course of events. Harold knew this. Whoever places the crown on their head first forces everyone else to wrest it away. And taking it away is always harder than holding on to it. Now, let's step back and look at the whole map. By February of 1966, 3 powers had formed a triangle, each claiming the English throne as their own. Harold Godwinson, the crowned king, controlled the south of England and its navy. William of Normandy, the duke with the strongest army in Western Europe, held a family claim through Emma. Then there's the third player, often overlooked, Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway. His claim traced back to Canute the Great, the Danish king who conquered England 50 years earlier and ruled it. Harold considered himself the rightful heir to that Scandinavian empire. 3 armies, 3 crowns, 1 island. Remember this setup. It's about to click into place like clockwork. Then William made a move that transformed a local dispute between 2 claimants into a pan-European event. He sent an embassy to the Pope. His argument was laid out like a legal case. First point, Edward had promised William the crown. Second point, Harold personally swore an oath to support William's claim to the throne, swearing on holy relics, which in the 11th century was as binding as a contract sealed in blood. Third point, Harold broke that oath and usurped the crown. The conclusion? William was not a conqueror, but a restorer of justice. The one who broke a sacred oath deserved punishment. Pope Alexander II agreed. William received the papal banner and blessing. What began as a feudal adventure transformed into something like a holy war. Knights from all across France, from Flanders, Brittany, and even southern Italy rallied under his banner, not for land, not for gold, but for the forgiveness of their sins. Norman propaganda turned a dubious oral promise, backed by no independent source, into a call for a crusade. A single conversation, which may never have even happened, became the foundation for an invading army. The situation was paradoxical. Harold held the crown, but his claim came through a questionable election. William had no crown, yet he carried the Pope's blessing and the support of an international alliance. Harold Hardrada claimed ancient rights by conquest, backed by a fleet of 300 warships. Each of the 3 could argue why the throne belonged to him, but none of these claims were strong enough to make the others simply give up. Diplomacy had run its course. only swords remained. Yet all summer of the year 1066, the English Channel lay between William and England, and the winds blew against him. The southern coast of England, summer of 1066. Thousands of people camped along the shoreline, eyes fixed on the water, day after day, week after week, month after month. Harold had gathered the largest militia in English history, positioning it facing the English Channel, the very direction William was expected to come from. Ships stood ready, watchmen never slept. All summer long, the Norman fleet couldn't cross the strait. The wind stubbornly blew from the north, straight into the faces of the Norman ships. William waited in Normandy, Harold waited in England. And here, the darkest chapter begins. The very wind that shielded England also became its undoing. One thing you have to understand about the English army in the 11th century is what made it tick. At its core was the Fyrd, a people's militia. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, small landowners, pulled straight from their plows and anvils. According to Anglo-Saxon tradition, their service lasted no more than about 2 months. They arrived in spring, stood their ground all summer, but by early September, their food supplies ran out. Not figuratively, literally, there was nothing left to feed the men. Grain, dried meat, malt for brewing beer, all gone. Meanwhile, back home, the unharvested crops were rotting because no one was there to bring them in. Harold faced a choice with no good options. If he kept the army together, it would start to fall apart on its own, hungry and bitter. If he disbanded it, the southern coast would be left wide open. He knew William was still across the channel. The wind was still against him. Maybe the Normans wouldn't dare cross until winter. Or maybe the wind would shift tomorrow. But there was already no food to feed the men today. In early September, Harold disbanded the militia. The men went home. The fleet was called back to London. The southern coast of England stood unguarded. The decision was perfectly logical and utterly fateful. Because right around the same days when the last militia groups dispersed into their villages, sails appeared on the northeastern horizon of England. Many sails, around 300 ships. This was the armada of King Harald Hardrada of Norway, the very same ruler who claimed an ancient right to the English throne. And standing beside him was Tostig, Harold's own brother, exiled and burning for revenge. Two enemies joined forces. The Norwegians landed in Yorkshire and began to ravage everything in their path. Harold learned of this in London, and here, credit where it's due, he didn't hesitate for a single day. He gathered everyone he could, housecarls, his personal retinue, the remnants of the militia, and rushed north. A forced march from London to Yorkshire, about 200 miles in 4 to 5 days, on foot and horseback along autumn roads without any supply trains, a speed almost unbelievable for the 11th century. On September 25, 1066, Harold struck the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge. They weren't expecting an attack. Some warriors hadn't even put on their armor. The battle was fierce and brutal. Harald Hardrada, one of the most seasoned fighters of his time, a man who had fought from Constantinople all the way to Sicily, was struck by an arrow in the throat. Tostig fell right beside him. Out of 300 Norwegian ships, only about 20 to 30 made it home. The defeat was total. But Harold paid a terrible price for this victory. His best huscarls, professional warriors clad in chainmail and wielding two-handed axes, fell by the dozens. The army, already worn down by a march across the entire country, lost men who couldn't be replaced. You can train a peasant to fight in a week. A huscarl takes years to raise. After the battle in Yorkshire, Harold finally exhaled. The Norwegian threat was crushed. Tostig was dead. The North was saved. It was time to let the people rest, heal their wounds, and wait for reinforcements. He had only 2 days left. On September 27th, just 48 hours after Stamford Bridge, the wind over the English Channel shifted. The very wind that had kept William bottled up in Normandy all summer turned 180 degrees and blew from the south. The Norman fleet raised its sails and set course for the English shore. Around 700 ships carried 7,000 to 8,000 warriors, including heavy cavalry. They landed at Pevensey on the southern coast, the very spot Harold had left undefended 2 weeks earlier. If the wind had shifted a week earlier, Harold would have faced William with a fresh, rested army dug into fortified positions. If the wind had changed a week later, Harold would have returned from the north, rallied a new militia, and brought up reserves. But the wind shifted at the worst possible moment for England. The army was drained, scattered across the country, the best fighters dead, and the king was more than 300 miles away from the landing site. 2 days. That was the difference between salvation and disaster. Just 2 days and the wind's direction over the channel. Harold turned his exhausted, battered, and thinned-out army around and drove them south again, straight toward William, straight toward what awaited him on a hill near a small coastal town whose name would echo across Europe just days later. October 14th, 1066. Senlac Hill, about 6 miles north of Hastings. A cold October wind blows in from the channel, and the grass on the slope glistens with morning dew. At the summit, a solid line of shields. The Anglo-Saxons took a position any commander would call perfect for defense. The slope rises gently, but steeply enough to sap a horse's momentum uphill. Ravines and marshy lowlands protect the flanks. The only way to attack is head-on, from bottom to top. Harold knew he had no choice. His army, the battered force left after a forced march of over 180 miles, and the slaughter at Stamford Bridge, numbered between 6,000 and 8,000 men, roughly the same as William's. But William had heavy cavalry and archers. Harold had infantry and axes. His one advantage, the high ground. If that shield wall held, the cavalry below would crash against it like waves breaking on a seawall. And they fought. Hour after hour, the Norman horsemen urged their steeds up the slope. Hooves slipped on the wet grass. The horses struggled through the mud. At the top, a wall of oak shields waited, behind which stood huscarls wielding two-handed axes. Each strike cut down horse and rider alike. The cavalry was pushed back. Archers fired from below, but their arrows flew high, lost among the shields. The infantry climbed up, only to fall back again. Norman losses mounted. Then a rumor swept through the attacking ranks. William was dead. The Duke removed his helmet and rode past the lines with his face uncovered, making sure they saw him. The panic subsided. The attacks resumed. The Anglo-Saxons held their ground, and here is where the moment came that decided England's fate. On the left flank, the Norman cavalry pulled back once again. Their retreat looked genuine. Riders turned their horses, broke formation, and headed down the slope. Was this a calculated ruse or a spontaneous flight that William later turned into a tactic? Historians still debate. But the outcome was the same. Some of the Anglo-Saxons, those holding the edge of the line, those who had stood their ground for 6 hours and now saw the enemy finally break, couldn't hold. They surged down the hill, chasing the retreating forces. It was a mistake they couldn't undo. As soon as the Anglo-Saxons left the summit, they lost everything. The high ground, their formation, the shield cover on their flanks. On the flat land below, they became a scattered mob of infantry facing a cavalry fully deployed. The Norman horsemen struck from both sides. Those running were cut down in the open. But worse was yet to come. A gap opened in the shield wall at the top, and into that gap poured the second wave. The wall began to crumble, not all at once, in chunks, in scattered sections. The Huscarls kept fighting fiercely around the royal standard, but the defensive lines ceased to exist as a unified front. The battle fragmented into dozens of isolated skirmishes on the hillside, where the advantage of higher ground no longer mattered. Then the standard fell. According to legend, Harold was killed by an arrow that struck his eye. The Bayeux Tapestry, a 70-meter-long embroidery created just a few years after the battle, shows his death this way. Whether this is fact or artistic license by the victors is hard to say. But what we do know for certain is that by sunset on October 14th, Harold was dead. His body was so badly mutilated that only his wife could recognize him by the scars she alone knew. An army without a king is just a crowd. The Anglo-Saxons broke and fled. Norman cavalry chased them until darkness fell. On the morning of October 15th, William stood on the hill where just a day before the shield wall had held firm. Beneath his feet lay the bodies. England had lost its king and its army in a single day. But then, William did something unexpected. He didn't march straight to London. The capital lay 100 kilometers to the north, still holding people capable of organizing resistance. A direct assault risked getting bogged down, so William chose a different path. He began a deliberate campaign of devastation across the southern counties. Village by village, he tore through the land. Crops burned in the fields. Livestock was seized or slaughtered. Granaries were emptied. Houses went up in flames. Smoke from the fires hung over Kent and Sussex for weeks. This wasn't senseless cruelty, it was calculated strategy. Every burned farm, every destroyed grain store sent a clear message to London's defenders. You're next, and no help is coming. William didn't rush. He tightened the noose, moving toward the capital in a wide arc, leaving behind a scorched earth that made supplying the garrison impossible. By December, London's nobility had come to a grim conclusion. The army was gone. The king was dead. The southern lands lay in ashes. No reinforcements would arrive. The city surrendered without a single battle. On December 25, 1666, Christmas Day, William entered Westminster Abbey and was crowned King of England. Outside, Norman soldiers stood guard, but when they heard shouting from inside, they thought a rebellion had broken out. The voices were actually the Anglo-Saxon nobles cheering the new king, as tradition dictated. Mistaking the cheers for an uprising, the soldiers set nearby houses on fire. The coronation ended amid the smell of smoke and the screams of crowds fleeing the flames. William wore the crown, but what he had done to the southern lands on his way to London, burned farms, stolen livestock, destroyed grain, was only a preview. The North had yet to face what was coming. A crown on his head, but beneath his feet, quicksand. After the coronation, uprisings erupted across England, especially in the north, against the Norman invaders. Yorkshire, Northumbria, Mercia. The Anglo-Saxons refused to accept a stranger as their king just because he'd been anointed in Westminster. Local thanes rallied militias. Danish ships brought reinforcements into the Humber estuary. Monks hid rebels in abbeys. This wasn't a single war, it was dozens of small conflicts raging at once, scattered across a land half the size of modern-day France. William would put out one fire, only to find another blazing behind him. This is where we need to pause and make one thing clear. William was a ruthless man, even by the brutal standards of his time. But what he did in the north defied the rules of any era. This wasn't just crushing a rebellion, it was wiping out the very possibility of rebellion. Forever. In the winter of 1669 to 1770, William unleashed a Scorched Earth strategy. This campaign would go down in history as the harsh ravaging of the North. Norman forces moved village to village, methodical, unhurried. They burned homes to the ground. Grain stores were broken open. Grain was either seized or dumped into rivers. Plows were smashed. Livestock, cows, sheep, pigs, were slaughtered right on the pasture. Even the seed grain reserved for spring planting was destroyed. This wasn't rage, it was a calculated plan. The Normans didn't hunt rebels, they didn't interrogate peasants, they obliterated the infrastructure. The very things that allowed people to survive in such a harsh climate. Northern England was no Provence. Winters dropped below freezing, the ground froze solid, and without food stores or shelter, people would die within weeks. William understood this perfectly. The consequences came fast. Burned crops meant there was nothing to plant in the spring. Without seeds, there would be no harvest in the fall. Slaughtered livestock meant no milk, no meat, and no draft animals to plow the fields. The cycle tightened. One winter of hunger turned into a full year of starvation, and that year stretched into several. Now let's talk numbers. Norman forces systematically burned villages, destroyed crops, and slaughtered livestock. The result? widespread famine that wiped out between half and 2/3 of the entire northern population. Pause for a moment on that figure. 2/3. This wasn't just battle casualties where soldiers fall. These were the elderly, women, and children who simply didn't survive until the next harvest. Imagine a modern city with a population of 1 million, roughly the size of 13 Luzhniki stadiums packed together. Now, erase 2 out of every 3 people from that city. Empty homes, silent streets. That's the scale of devastation in Yorkshire and Northumbria. 16 years later, when the land survey was conducted, vast northern territories were still recorded with one chilling word: waste. The land remained lifeless for an entire generation. Historians still debate whether the devastation of the North qualifies as genocide. Strictly speaking, the term is anachronistic. It wouldn't be coined for more than 800 years. But in essence, systematic destruction of a region's livelihood to break the will of its people is exactly what the 20th century would call genocide. And that was just one side of the purge. The other was more targeted. Through conquest and crushing rebellions, the Anglo-Saxon nobility was almost completely wiped out. About 4,000 feudal lords, thanes, earls, local landowners were killed or executed. Another 30,000 fled the country. Some escaped to Scotland, others to Scandinavia, and in an ironic twist, many made their way to Byzantium, where Anglo-Saxon warriors enlisted in the emperor's Varangian Guard. The former elite of an entire kingdom became mercenaries on the opposite side of Europe. 4,000 dead, 30,000 driven out. This wasn't just crushing a rebellion, it was a complete overhaul of the ruling class. Imagine wiping out everyone who knew how to govern, judge, collect taxes, and command, then replacing them with outsiders who spoke a different language. But William didn't stop at destruction. He built, and he built with a plan. This is where the strategy that separates a conqueror from a mere destroyer becomes clear. By handing out confiscated lands to Norman barons, William deliberately scattered their estates. One baron might get a manor in Kent, another in Yorkshire, a third on the Welsh border. Hundreds of miles between them. No vassal could gather his lands into a single stronghold, raise a local militia, and challenge the crown. This was the exact opposite of what happened on the continent, where French dukes ruled compact territories and ignored their king for decades. England never caught that disease because William inoculated it beforehand. In the year 1085, he did something no other medieval ruler had ever done. William carried out a comprehensive survey of all the land and people, every acre, every mill, every head of livestock. The results were compiled into a document the English called the Doomsday Book because, like the Last Judgment, there was no escape and no appeal. The survey recorded not only what each baron owned, but also how much he owed the crown. It was terror transformed into accounting, violence encoded in legal form. Here's the bottom line. The North lies depopulated. The Anglo-Saxon nobility has been wiped out. Norman barons are scattered, each locked into separate estates. Every inch of land is recorded, accounted for, and taxed. England became the most centralized kingdom in Western Europe. The price? Tens of thousands dead, counties burned to the ground, and a ruling class speaking a language their own people couldn't understand. William secured a kingdom for his heirs, one that wouldn't fall apart. But by the end of his life, he was a man trusted by no one, not even his own sons. For 21 years, William lived between two shores of the English Channel. Every spring, he boarded a ship in Southampton, sailing to Rouen to deal with Norman barons who, left unchecked, would immediately start tearing each other apart. By autumn, he returned to Winchester to make sure his grip on England hadn't slipped. Then back to Normandy, then back to England again. Two separate realms, divided by a stretch of water, held together by a single bond, his personal will. There was no shared parliament, no unified legal code, no common currency. Just one man in his 60s, shuttling back and forth across the channel like a traveling salesman moving between branches. And this man, the conqueror of England, the ravager of the North, the author of the Doomsday Book, was at war again in the summer of 1087. This time, he was fighting the King of France. The dispute centered on the border town of Mons. William captured the town and burned it to the ground. Routine. He had been burning cities his entire life. His horse walked slowly over glowing embers. It stumbled on a smoldering shard. William fell forward, and the metal stirrup struck him hard in the abdomen. This was a man who had survived dozens of battles, who had outlasted plots by his own barons, and who had endured a rebellion led by his eldest son. Yet he suffered a mortal wound from his own saddle. Not a sword, not a spear, not an arrow, a saddle stirrup. What followed was slow decay. The wound became inflamed. Infection spread through his body, month after month. They took William to the Saint Gervais monastery near Rouen. There he lay, struggling to breathe, surrounded by doctors who could do nothing, and courtiers who simply waited. Just waited. This is where it gets truly revealing. William had 3 sons: Robert, William the Red, and Henry. Any normal ruler, lying on his deathbed, would first sort out the question of succession. But William didn't. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, because he didn't trust any of them. Robert had already rebelled against him once. William the Red was unpredictable. Henry was too young and too cunning. The man who built a system of total control over an entire kingdom couldn't establish basic trust within his own family. He understood this. Whichever son inherited the crown would immediately start reshaping his legacy to suit themselves, and there was nothing he could do about it. 6 months of agony passed, and not a single clear command about who would inherit England, only vague hints and evasive words. On September 9th, 1987, William died. Then something happened that had never occurred when a king died anywhere in Europe. Or rather, it had happened before, but only during coups and palace revolts, never with the peaceful death of a legitimate ruler. The servants, knights, and courtiers, everyone who kept watch at his bedside, immediately started looting the palace. They dragged off silverware, clothing, weapons, and fine fabrics. Some even snatched rings from the king's still warm fingers. The body of the King of England and Duke of Normandy lay on the floor of an empty monastery room. For days, no one came to claim it. No one organized a funeral procession. No one sent a coffin. Eventually, a low-ranking knight, not a count, a bishop, or a baron, paid out of his own pocket to hire a cart and transport the body to Caen, to the Abbey of St. Stephen, which William himself had once founded. The journey took several days. It was a hot September, and the body began to decompose. Next comes a legend, recorded by the chronicler Orderic Vitalis, roughly 50 years after the event. According to his account, when they tried to lower the swollen body into a stone sarcophagus, it simply wouldn't fit. The monks began forcing it in. Then the corpse burst open. The church filled with such a foul stench that everyone scrambled for the exit. The service was ruined. Whether this is true or just a story, we don't know. But here's what we do know. Half a century later, a chronicler thought it worth recording, and no other chroniclers challenged it. No one rushed to defend the memory of the great king. On the contrary, the story spread eagerly, told with flair, each retelling adding new details. That says more about William than any battle ever could. Chroniclers who lived during or shortly after his time left behind a verdict that stings like a sentence. His heart was too cruel for love. Not too cruel for enemies, too cruel for love. Even by the brutal standards of the 11th century, when cruelty was a ruler's everyday tool, his contemporaries believed William had crossed the line. He forced absolute obedience. No baron dared challenge him. No province risked rebellion. But the moment his chest stopped rising, everything he had built on fear vanished into thin air like steam. All that remained was a bloated corpse on a cart, drawn by a hired horse down a dusty Norman road. Yet what he set in motion, the mingling of 200,000 settlers with the local people, Norman knights with Anglo-Saxon wives, French words with German roots, this took on a life of its own, and nothing could stop it. Not even him. 200,000 people arrived from the continent, mostly from France, to replace the wiped-out Anglo-Saxon nobility. By the end of William's reign, these newcomers made up about 20% of the island's population, yet they owned 90% of the land. 1 in every 5 residents held control over 9/10 of all farmland, forests, and villages. In simple terms, the entire elite was replaced. This wasn't reform, integration, or compromise. It was a full takeover. Imagine a modern country where a minority arrives, claims nearly all the property, and declares their language the official tongue. That is exactly what happened. French became the official language of England. So did Latin. Meanwhile, English, the very old English once used for writing laws, conducting trade, and delivering sermons, was banned from official use. The royal court spoke French. Courts handled cases in French. Land deeds were written in French. Want to file a complaint? You'd better do it in the language of the new rulers. Want to make a deal, land a position, or climb even one step above village leader? Learn French. And this wasn't a temporary situation. It lasted not 10 years, not 50, but several centuries. English only returned to official documents in the 15th century. For more than 300 years, the language of an entire people survived as a domestic tongue, a kitchen language, a village dialect spoken quietly among those no one paid attention to. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the language didn't die. Migration from the continent was mostly a male affair. Knights, younger sons, adventurers, they came to fight and claim land. They usually didn't bring wives with them. So they married local women, Anglo-Saxon women. A Norman knight speaking French and his wife speaking English raised children who grew up hearing both languages from birth. The mother sang lullabies in one, the father gave orders in the other. The kids grew up bilingual. This generation, not conquerors or the conquered, but their shared descendants, started doing what any child caught between 2 languages does. They mixed them. They simplified. They borrowed a handy word from one language, a grammatical structure from the other. Not because the king commanded it, not because scholars decided so, simply because it made life easier. But before we explore what came from this fusion, we need to understand what was lost in the process. Before the Norman Conquest, Anglo-Saxon society was surprisingly progressive in one specific area for the early Middle Ages. Women could own property. Women could get divorced. That wasn't the norm in most European societies at the time, but in England, it worked. After the year 1066, everything changed. Norman law pushed women into a subordinate position. Property passed to the husband. Divorce became nearly impossible. Historians still debate how widely these rights were actually practiced before the conquest. Few documents survive. But the legal rollback is clear. The new system erased the freedoms the old one had allowed. So, what does it all add up to? Who's to blame, and what was the outcome? In the 19th century, writer Walter Scott described the Norman Conquest as a national disaster. For the Anglo-Saxons of the year 1066, it certainly was. Their land was taken, their language outlawed, their rights stripped away, their elite either destroyed or forced into exile. But modern historian Maxim Gorilov urges us to take a clearer look at the situation. He argues that William wasn't a genius. Instead, he was a shrewd and fortunate man who knew how to make the most of his luck. Not a great strategist, just a pragmatist who found himself in the right place at the right time, wielding the right number of swords. Both views, the romantic tragedy of Scott and Gorilov's practical take on fortune, don't contradict each other. They complement one another. The disaster didn't happen because a genius arrived. It happened because dozens of factors converged, from the death of Harold Hardrada in the north to a sudden change of wind in the English Channel. Now, the result. The one we carry with us every day without even thinking about it. Modern English is about 40% made up of words with French origins. Army, religion, prophet, government, justice. Each of these words traces back to a Norman knight who married an Anglo-Saxon woman and raised bilingual children. The banned language didn't die out. Instead, it did something clever. It absorbed the vocabulary of the occupiers. A Germanic skeleton grew French flesh. And from this mix, born not in a university, but in kitchens, bedrooms, and cradle rooms, emerged the language that today connects 1.5 billion people worldwide. The conquest reshaped the country itself. Before 1066, England belonged to the Scandinavian world. Danish kings, Norwegian claimants, trade routes to Norway and Denmark. Then everything flipped 180 degrees. England became a power in Western Europe, firmly tied to the politics of France. The 100 Years' War, the fight over Aquitaine, dynastic marriages with the Capetians and Valois, all direct consequences of a Norman bastard deciding the crown was rightfully his. Here's the thing. One man, not a genius, just a lucky figure with an iron grip, set in motion a process that transformed the language, law, geopolitics, and social structure of an entire island. He never intended to create a new language. He didn't think about women's rights. He didn't design Europe's future direction. He simply wanted a crown and land. And history took his ambitions and ran with them in its own way. Walter Scott called it a disaster. Maybe he was right. But from that disaster grew a civilization that gave the world a global language, the idea of land registration, and the tradition of parliamentary government. It all started with one battle, one hill, and one arrow. An arrow we still don't know for sure if it was ever even fired. Yet the world we live in took shape because of that moment, in part because on October 14th, 1066, the wind blew just the right way.